Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to see this grid of faces and squares. My name is Saima Akhtar. I'm the Associate Director of the Vagelos Computational Science Center at Barnard College. And I, along with the Faculty Director, Rebecca Wright, would like to welcome everyone to a panel discussion on digital redlining as part of the Undesign the Redline exhibition at Barnard College. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Miriam Neptune, Mary Rocco, Vanessa Till, and everyone else involved in putting up the exhibition, organizing the symposium, and encouraging us to have nuanced and difficult conversations around the history of redlining in the US and in our own backyards, its implications for today, and creatively thinking about how to undesign the red line. Today's panel thinks about how urban practices emerging from early 20th century homeowners loan corporation, or HOLC maps, are related to contemporary digital practices. As our panelists will discuss today, this can take the form of limitations around goods and services available in neighborhoods that have been historically redlined, including same-day deliveries, internet service providers, and broadband, and the rates at which mortgages get approved based on location. We attempt to connect the concepts of digital redlining to the many thought-provoking conversations that are taking place during this symposium about how systemic inequities in the built environment of neighborhoods, cities, and homes are related to and become exacerbated by digital inequities. This is a timely conversation as we all gather online today, and since the pandemic has clearly shown us that broadband is an essential service that is not equally distributed or accessible at affordable prices, even in our major cities. A viral photograph of young girls doing their homework in a fast food parking lot this past year was taken not in rural America, but in Salinas, California, which has a population density of around 6,500 people per square mile. And just this morning, the House passed the Build Back Better plan on the heels of a $1 trillion infrastructure plan that includes funds for expanding broadband coverage across the US, a move that has been a long time coming. As noted in a recent comprehensive study by the Open Technology Institute, which found that in the United States, the United States has on average the most expensive and slowest internet among any modern economy. And that's just the tip of the iceberg as we dig in deeper with a fantastic group of panelists who I'm grateful have dedicated the time and effort to share their work with us. We'll start this panel with short talks from each panelist and then open it up to a discussion and Q&A with the audience towards the end. I encourage anyone watching to use the Q&A and chat to comment and ask questions, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So in order of their presentations, first we have Greta Byrum, who is the program director for the Social Science Research Council's Just Tech program. Previously, Greta founded Community Tech New York, a nonprofit building collaborative community-owned broadband ecosystems with local partners, co-created the New School's Digital Equity Lab, and founded the Resilient Communities program at New America, an initiative bringing storm-hardened mesh Wi-Fi to 5 neighborhoods in New York City's flood zones. Next, we have Dr. Chris Gilliard, who is a writer, professor, and speaker. His scholarship concentrates on digital privacy, surveillance, and the intersections of race, class, and technology. He's currently a Harvard Kennedy School Shorenstein Center visiting research fellow, a member of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry Scholars Council, and a member of the Surveillance Technology Oversight Project Community Advisory Board. And then we have Emmanuel Martinez, who is a data reporter for the Markup. His most recent work examined access to home ownership and mortgage discrimination, where he analyzed 31 million housing records to prove that people of color were being routinely denied mortgages in 61 major US metropolitan areas. His work has garnered awards such as the Alfred L. DuPont Columbia University Award, the George Foster Peabody Award, and the Selden Ring Award for Investigative Reporting. Last year, he was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. And so with that, I will hand it off to Greta.
Thanks so much, Saima, and I'm so happy to be here today. I just wanted to acknowledge the news that just came about the Rittenhouse acquittal, and I just want to acknowledge that before we start, because I know that many folks may be feeling grief and anger, and we're here to talk about a lot of difficult issues, and you know, I just hope people take care in whatever way works for them as we move through this material. So that said, I'm going to get started with hopefully just providing kind of a thematic overview of the problem of digital redlining that can be a bit of a reference for this conversation. So, sorry. Here we go. So digital redlining is often in the sort of most traditional sense thought of as, you know, where is internet available and where is it not available? And so, you know, I'm going to name 3 types of redlining that I think we should be thinking about that are apropos. And the first one is just sort of basic infrastructural redlining. And so, you know, folks are probably familiar with these maps from the 1940s. This is a map of Cleveland, you know, showing how the red marked areas were you know, set off where investment was really prohibited in those areas based on mostly racial data. And then I want to just compare that to this map of digital redlining in Cleveland in 2017. So we've got 1940 and 2017. So just looking back and forth, what does that look like? The pink areas are areas of the city in which 35% or more of the residents are in poverty, and the green areas are areas where AT&T has invested in high-speed fiber. And so basically what we see is, you know, this very clear physical infrastructural difference. And it's based on, you know, essentially a logic of investing where people have the funds to pay for the service. And so we see a kind of a movement from an explicitly racial or racist policy to a policy that is created by a desire to maximize shareholder revenue. So the second red line I want to name is kind of the red line within the red line. And so this is kind of where you see physical and other kinds of identity or category-based redlining happening, where you know, people you know, essentially, first of all, I should say this is a data portal that's created by Community Tech New York, an organization where I used to work, and the Cornell School of Industrial and Labor Relations. And it's a set of data that is meant to really get a lot more detail and understanding of what's happening now in terms of who has internet and who does not. So again, what we see here is division and difference. And what I wanted to call attention to specifically is, you know, when you look statewide, you know, you see like a map that looks like the rural areas are underserved. But then when you look at the categories by race and ethnicity, you see, for example, that although the state is 52.5% white, 44% of white folks do not have broadband at home. Compare that with Black or African American, 13.7% of the state's population, but 18% of those who do not have broadband at home. So this is where we see like this kind of layer of identity that presents another kind of red line within the physical red line. And when you start zooming in, so look at this sort of area of Erie County over here, zoom into Buffalo, the picture starts looking a little worse. And then you zoom even further in, this is Buffalo. And essentially what you see here is the difficulty of really understanding the red line, digital redlining at scale, because you see it so often where there are just differences between neighborhoods, where wealthy neighborhoods most people have internet, and poorer neighborhoods, most people do not. But I think that there's another red line that we need to talk about, and this is a lot, we owe a debt to Sophia Noble in how she has written about algorithmic oppression as another type of redlining. And so we have this myth of the internet as this kind of, open superhighway of information. This is the sort of typical way that people talk about this, amazing technology that was created in the last century. But, we need to ask, how open this information system really is, and to what extent, in fact, the internet is built on a logic of taxonomy and categorization that lends itself really easily to racial taxonomies and racism. Sophia Noble calls this the underlying racism of code. And I think, and says that algorithmic oppression is not just a glitch in the system, but rather is fundamental to the operating system of the web. This is a New York City fusion center, which is where data is harvested en masse from anybody who happens to be in the area. So you basically do not have constitutional protections in fusion center areas. And so, this is a place where license plate readers, all kinds of surveillance happen. And of course, these areas happen to also be in traditionally redlined areas of cities. I also wanted to call attention to kind of what is the feeling of being digitally redlined in terms of algorithmic oppression. And I'm citing some quotes from a report from 2018. These are quotes that were gathered by the Our Data Bodies project. I think what I want to say about this is that, the kind of effect of the feeling of being redlined is really alienated from its root. So you have like an internet that's built on taxonomies of sequestering and managing information. But by the time you feel, the effects of those surveillance, it feels like things like not being able to get a job or being refused for certain kinds of services. So it's kind of an alienated feeling of oppression, which I think is an important, to recognize that this redlining is not just something you experience by virtue of not having internet, but actually that having internet is really complex. So I want to just call attention to Lola here, who says both accessibility to the internet is just as important as other basic human rights because it's a way for people to provide means for their family, etc. But at the same time, Lola says, I don't know, I just feel like a number, I don't even know. So, the thing about the red line is, it's a problem of exclusion, but then when we actually are trying to solve for inclusion, essentially then we have to ask, what are people being included in and what does that mean for them? And so I think when we're talking about undesigning the red line, what we have to remember is not to get stuck in the paradigm of inclusion or of selling the product of internet service, and instead imagine logics of the commons, of care, of non-binarism. And I'm just showing a couple of examples of work that I know of in communities that's amazing. So shouting out a couple of groups that that build internet from the ground up. This again is from the Digital Equity Portal, and sharing this just as an example of, these are community anchor institutions. When we're planning to undesign the red line, instead of sort of turning towards the metaverse and turning away from the fabric of community, something like focusing on where are their service or organizing centers of power within a city is really important to this process of reimagining. And, the final thing I want to say is there's a lot of money and resources. I mean, this is a recognized problem, and I think a lot of folks have been thinking about it creatively for a long time. And so there's a lot of good work going on. And I want to make folks aware of a fellowship we just launched at the Social Science Research Council, which is open right now for folks working on social justice and technology. And I also want to say that right now, there's about almost $50 billion coming through the National Telecommunication Information Agency from the infrastructure bill for internet. So there's a huge demand here for folks who can be organizers, who can build from the ground up, who can think in the logics of care and the commons, and try to bend or shape this kind of logic of taxonomy and categorization away from the ways that they divide us. So I'm going to wrap up there and pass it back to Saima.
Thank you so much, Greta. And next we have Chris Gilliard.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for having me. And Greta, that was amazing, and I am so sorry I didn't talk to you before I decided what I was going to talk about, because you touched on so many. I mean, you didn't just touch on them, right? You covered so many of the things that I wanted to talk about, and so I'm looking forward to having a discussion about them. There's just a few things I'd want to accentuate that you already talked about. One being the way that the infrastructure of the internet is built, really built on the racialized logics of pre-existing like data and geography. And so that if you look at a lot of maps, right, if you take a HOLC map and overlay it with broadband access, but even things like same day delivery or Uber service, or where scooters are placed, or who can get grocery delivery and things like that, we start to see the ways in which these systems are kind of legacy in a lot of ways. And I think what's important, and what my work has focused on, particularly in the last 2 years, is the ways in which that often these things are life and death. I mean, I think that a lot of people have understood for a long time that this was the case, but I think the pandemic has put this in really graphic relief. And when people before had said that these questions were kind of issues of life and death, that it was seen as hyperbolic. But in terms of who can get delivery of medicine, who can get delivery of medicine, who can get access to healthcare, who can get information about healthcare, who can sign up for a vaccine. All of those things now are understood, I think, by a lot more people in terms of like how serious and important it is. And it's not just a question of like, do you have Netflix, or can you stream certain movies and things like that. The other thing I'm really interested in and working on is the extent to which, and Greta touched on this as well, the placement of surveillance in communities often again falls along these same lines, whether that's shot spotter or predictive policing mechanisms, that many times, I mean, most often, that the placement of these devices, again, maps like kind of directly onto a lot of the same maps, or maps directly onto the same areas that we would see if we looked at an HOLC map of a particular area. So that's, yeah, Greta, you did so much, but those are the things I'm working on. I'm really interested in talking about with everyone as we move forward. Thank you, and I'll go back to Saima.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of intersections and overlaps here, so I'm really looking forward to talking with all of you. And so we also have Emmanuel Martinez, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Saima. And I don't know, I appreciate following Greta and Chris in terms of overlaying the importance of the redlining maps, because I think for me as a housing nerd, I think a lot of society's inequities are focused on housing. And what do I mean by that? I think when you can segregate where people live, you can segregate so many other services like education, like internet, as Greta was saying, same day service, as Chris was adding. I think housing is so central to everything. And I think that's why the redlining maps are so important to understand, and how they were structured in the past, and how they're kind of prophecy for what is happening now. And so my work based on that has, like, at least for the previous 5 years, I've been working on issues of redlining, like the OG redlining of systematically denying people of color, particularly Black people, mortgages. And even though we're 50 years more than 50 years past the Fair Housing Act that made redlining illegal, right? We still see a disproportionate amount of denials for Black people and other people of color. And so the question that I have set out to ask is why is that happening, right? If redlining is illegal and lenders can get in trouble for discriminating against people of color, against prospective Black homeowners, why is this still going on? And the latest story that I published, the latest project that I found, that I worked on, kind of unpacks that from the algorithms that decide risk, that calculate risk. And we found that well, first of all, the variables that lenders told me were important and decide that form the backbone of lending. When I include some of those variables, we still see these disparities. And so we start unpacking how risk is decided when it comes to mortgage lending. And we find that it has a disproportionate impact on people of color, on Black Americans, right? Take, for example, credit score. Credit score is designed to measure risk, and it is based on data, and data is supposed to be presented as this objective measure of things. But what we don't talk about is what is included, how it's included, and what is left out. And I think credit score really embody that often people of color, Black people, have lower credit scores because of how those algorithms are designed, right? Having a mortgage and having a good credit score has a chicken and egg relationship. While you need a good credit score to get a mortgage, but you also, having a mortgage can help you improve a credit score. And people who rent, and even though they make all their rent payments are on time, those calculations, that data collection is not included in credit scores. That is one aspect of why we are seeing these disproportionate denials. The other factors have to include the algorithms that are designed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and those two quasi-governmental agencies are the ones who buy the mortgages from all these lenders, and so they kind of set the standards, right? They allow lenders to continue to make more loans, continue to lend out money without assuming the risk. Once they sell it off to Fannie and Freddie, that money is off the hook. And so the algorithms considered by Fannie and Freddie are use variables that often have a disproportionate effect, something like a wealth, right? Wealth is considered as part of a way to assess risk. That the fact that if you lose your job, how are you going to pay back this loan? Well, how much wealth do you have accumulated, right? But because of policies like redlining, wealth is, white people have a disproportionate amount of wealth that Black families have, I think, or white families have 8 times the amount of wealth as Black families. But when you use wealth as a measure of risk in assessing who gets a mortgage and who doesn't, well, that's going to have a disproportionate impact on Black families. When you use property values, property values is also another form to gauge risk, but there has been many reports, many studies cited that Black families, their properties are undervalued and underappreciated compared to white families, right? And so what all these algorithms are doing is compounding the systemic inequities, the systemic and structural redlining that was once legal, and they're only repeating it back and spitting out the same thing, right? And so there's a school of thought that like probably many of you are familiar with, that like algorithms are not necessarily predictive of the future, but more so repeat past systemic inequities like redlining. Like when we think about having wealth, right? Like redlining was only illegal like one generation ago. And so many, like for Black families, like it is their grandparents who weren't allowed to own a home. And it is only their like parents are the first people who can actually own a home. And what does that say about intergenerational wealth and the ability to own a home? And so a lot of my work has focused on the mortgage system, the financial system, and how it really is this circle of like, once you're in it, you're kind of baked in it. And when you're kept out, it's really hard to kind of get a foot in the door. And so that is, with that, I think sums up most of what I've done in the past few years.
Thank you so much for that. That was all of you. That was really a really incredible way to put a host of issues and questions on the table. So I guess I would ask those of you who want to put your videos on so we can start a discussion. We're already getting a few questions in the chat. But what strikes me initially about all the things that you talked about is I remember Ruha Benjamin and some of her work as she started to explore issues around race and technology and what she calls the new Jim Code, is that in the same way that in order to remedy or find ways to work with systemic inequalities that stem from racism, we're also finding our way and finding our language around the relationship between inequities that stem from technology. And so as we start to name it and write about it and think about it and put a language to it, what to you, in the many ways that you're trying to tackle these issues around digital redlining, what are the ways in which you think we can start to move to the next step after naming and finding language? And that is posed to anyone.
Well, I think some of the stuff that I've seen as a result of my work, like I think first, like to your point, Simia, is that right? Like I think we have to think that data collection algorithms are not objective, and the way they are written by humans, right? And humans have their own biases. And I think like it's understanding, like if we are going to use algorithms and data collection and data as like a way to make decisions, it's understanding that like that the variables that we decide how to measure something are going to disproportionately affect people. And so, or a group of people. And so it's thinking critically about like, what variables are we using to measure, for example, risk? Like, and I say that in terms of like a lot of the housing advocates that I've been in touch with as a result of my work have been happy that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have decided to incorporate rent payments as a way to measure risk. And that is a variable that I think is more inclusive. And it's just a start, right? Because like there's so many other things that could be, in terms of mortgages and redlining, could be used to delve out home loans in a more equitable fashion. But I think it's thinking critically about like the variables that we are including and who is disproportionately affected or who benefits from those inclusions of those variables.
Yeah, I want to just build on what Emmanuel was saying, because I think this, and also responding to Justin in the chat, who's asking how they figure out wealth in the credit score algorithm. And I think it's important to understand like a little bit about automated decision making, which is used in so many different, I mean, basically everything we've talked about, mortgages, and decisions of like where to build infrastructure are also often based on kind of variables that go into a score of, you know, the likelihood that somebody would be able to pay a $80 a month score, $80 a month internet bill in a particular neighborhood. But also, you know, these algorithmic scores go into things like risk assessment for bail or sentencing. So it's part of the criminal justice system and all these other systems. And, you know, algorithmic decision making, these are often sort of black box formulas that, you know, pull from various, you know, long histories of data that are attached to a particular individual, and even go back, you know, further in history. And so a lot of the black box algorithmic systems, you know, are constructed using data that was historically flawed or historically biased and against particular populations, particular communities. And so, you know, it's kind of a self-perpetuating problem where the algorithms themselves are built using problematic data. And so they go on to predict problematic risk assessments. In, you know, this gets attached to people, and, you know, they may have like stolen some bubble gum when they were 14 or something, and then 30 years later they can't get a mortgage, or, you know, their child is taken by CPS, or like any number of things happen to people. So, and, you know, I think, you know, the Markup has done some good work on this in terms of risk assessments for sentencing and how this affects, you know, primarily, you know, people of color get higher risk assessments and end up going to jail more. I mean, it's a very real thing. So I think that's not your question, Saima, but just to get us all on the same page about algorithmic oppression.
Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important clarification to make. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, the comparison I often make is to the financial crash, and that I mean, I never knew before the crash what a credit default swap was, because I didn't think I needed to. But you know, shortly after that, we all became much more of informed about finance because it was so clear. It was even more clear how much that had to do with our everyday lives. And I think there's been kind of several watershed moments similarly with data. And so that for a long time, we've, I think, ceded the ground of expertise to data scientists and computer scientists who are in no way experts in people's lived experience most often. And, you know, as Greta said, right, it can mean things like whether your child is taken out of your home or whether you are released from being incarcerated, if you're allowed to rent. I mean, on and on and on. It touches, and it doesn't just touch, right? It's like embedded in every aspect of our lives. And so I think that there's a couple moments, like one that I look at is the UK grading scandal, where people were kind of assigned grades algorithmically because people weren't able to finish their courses, and where students were in the UK were chanting, you know, pardon my language, right? But they were chanting "fuck the algo," as an example, right, of how people are starting to become much more aware of the ways in which these systems are influencing their lives. And to the extent that the people who are having the systems deployed against them often don't have any say in what the systems look like, or are not able to investigate the systems or appeal to them. But I do think in the last, you know, 4 or 5 years, and certainly not to say that people haven't been talking about this for much longer, but in the last 4 or 5 years, there have been a lot of moments where people who don't spend all their time looking at these systems have become experts in one way or another. I mean, another one I point to is the Atlantic Towers example, where people banded together and got facial recognition taken out of their apartment buildings. So there's been a lot of those moments in the past like 5 or so years where people really started to pay attention and become more aware of like the ways in which these systems affect their lives.
Yeah, so first, I feel like there's another question from Justin in the chat that I think gets at what I want to ask about next, which is they're asking, is it purposefully racist or a byproduct of former racist data, and how do we fix that? And that gets at this idea of intentionality. And we had a speaker visit us last week, Jiahao Chen, who was formerly the responsible AI lead for JP Morgan and now is the CTO for Parity AI, which is a startup that bills itself as an anti-racist AI startup that looks at data that is collected by certain kinds of companies, and they basically go through it and do an inventory of various kinds of biases that may exist in that data. And what he's an expert on is basically credit scores and how they were assigned from a big bank, JP Morgan, and how those biases are actually built into the numbers. And as you all are very eloquently saying, is that we tend to believe that numbers are neutral. Like, code is neutral, science is neutral. And as we start to talk about these examples that Chris, you're mentioning, we're now starting to get into a bit of more public awareness where, okay, wait a second, like, where are these biases emerging from? I thought that all of these systems were neutral because they're based on number crunching. And so what Jiahao was saying was that some of these banks actually can kind of work around biases that are protected, like certain class protections like gender and race, because they're implicit. They're based on location, zip code, et cetera, that are then reflective of where people live. And again, tying back to all of these issues that have been brought up by Undesign the Redline is old school redlining, as Emmanuel said. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this, the intentionality in digital redlining. How do we point at that? How do we get at it when it's a little bit, when it's slippery? And again, any of you can jump in.
Okay, I'll jump in.
Okay.
I think, I'm sorry, did I cut someone off? Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to, like, I think this question is so important. And I mean, Emmanuel, I feel like you probably have worked on this question of disparate impact versus intentionality, because it really comes up in housing the most. But yeah, I think that, you know, we're seeing some laws, you know, there was a Trump era law regarding housing that basically said, if you, this was actually a rulemaking from HUD that said, if you can't prove that there was intention in the disparate impact that a housing algorithm has on different populations, if you can't prove that it's intended to be, you know, discriminatory, then you know, it doesn't meet the bar of being unconstitutional, basically. And they also made it, you know, part of the rule was protecting the intellectual property of the companies that produce the algorithms. And I think, you know, so intentionality is really important from a legal perspective and a policy perspective. And I think it's one thing that's really difficult is that a lot of algorithmic systems, again, they're proprietary, they're black box, so you don't really know what's under the hood. And there may be like a mix of intentions and like best intentions and like terrible intentions. And then just like people who are like, I don't want to look under the hood because it's too hard. And I think that's certainly the case in terms of how the rubber meets the road and how these algorithmic decision-making tools are used. Yeah, so I think it's really complicated. And it's really apropos at this moment because we're looking at, you know, an administration coming in New York City that's very interested in automated decision-making and how we can use it as a way to run cities, for example. So yeah, anyways, that's my 2 cents.
I mean, I'm really interested in this question for a lot of reasons, and I tend to give a very unsatisfactory answer, which is to say it's neither and both. And so what I mean by that is when you think about housing or banking or policing, the long history of these institutions is deeply rooted in racism. And so to the extent that any technological system is built on that history, it's going to be racist. And so that there is, to the extent that policing is racist, I mean, the racist technological arm of policing is going to be racist, and that's like the system working as it is intended to be. I mean, today being a great example of that. But the other thing is, if we think about some of the sort of hallmark examples, right? Like when ProPublica investigated Facebook and found out that you could do targeting based on ethnic affinity, such that you could say, I don't want Black people to see this ad for jobs or housing. Or when Amazon rolled out same-day delivery in areas of Boston, all except for the area that had a high concentration of Black folks living there. So there wasn't someone at, I mean, you know, like, I mean, I don't have special insight into these companies other than reading most of the stuff that's written on them. I feel safe in saying, though, that there wasn't necessarily a data scientist or a computer scientist at Facebook and at Amazon saying, I don't want to serve Black people, but there wasn't anyone there saying the opposite, right? And so that the intentionality question gets pretty thorny because racism, you know, I mean, we've come to this understanding a lot again in the last couple of years. It's not enough to not have someone actively trying to be racist. We have to have people who are doing things to not be racist. And so when you know, so is there someone at Facebook saying, I mean, I don't know, right? Like, but there's in so many instances with these companies, we can be sure in saying that there's not someone who's there working hard enough or being listened to, for that matter, to make it so these systems don't do these things. Yeah.
I know that is well said, Chris. And I think I will add that I think like this is one of my pain points with journalism, and I think you see it a lot in law, and it's also a pain point I think in this country overall, considering the climate that we are in, that you can only call something racist if it's intentional, that you need to find that email that says, I hate Black and brown people and people of color, and like only until you find that email that you can call the system racist. And I think that I think we're in this moment where I think that notion is being challenged, but to what Chris said that really got my, I think, thoughts in order was that like housing was built on a racist system, like redlining, right? That's what we're here talking about, like the systemic and structural exclusion of like certain groups of people based on their color of their skin. And that has never been corrected. That has never been addressed. And because it hasn't been like solved, and all these solutions that like have been proposed to address redlining failed to tackle race in the opposite way that redlining did, like everything that comes out of housing is perpetuating that same racism, because we've never really fully addressed redlining. We've never solved these inequities in housing. And because I think housing is such central to everything else, those inequities spill out of housing into other factors of society, like internet, like same-day delivery, like where you place grocery stores, like where you place banks and payday lenders, which all contribute to credit score, which then contribute to who has access to housing.
Yeah, and if I can just respond to that, I think there is the problem that you're naming, Emmanuel, of nothing there. That underlying harm has never been addressed. But the other thing that's happened is like this supremacy of an economic ideology, where, you know, essential services are kind of meted out on the basis of return on investment. And so there's a market failure, meaning the market can't fix a problem that's so deeply entrenched, and, you know, it's entrenched in the actual physical, you know, fabric of infrastructure, of the built environment. And so, you know, because the logic of the market continually says you invest where there will be return on investment, it has the same outcome as explicitly racist redline policy, but those who, you know, advocate for like the supremacy of return on investment, they can say, well, that it's just economic policy. I'm not saying anything about race. And so it, you know, because I mean, I think it's a problem of naming, as you said, Saima, but it's also, you know, it's also about our financial system, and like that we're still operating on the logic of you know, capital is king, and we pay much less attention to care and well-being.
Yeah, Greta, that makes me think of what I was thinking about this when you were giving your introduction, and it's not something that actually, it made me think, because in my introduction, I was talking about how digital redlining can make itself apparent, and how it can be connected to what we think of as like physical infrastructure. And you said that we don't need to just think about who gets broadband, and who's being included and what does that mean for them. But we also need to think about, we can't get stuck in the idea of inclusion or selling the product of internet services. So this is also like within the logic of capitalism, we're thinking about what inclusion means. So what does it mean outside of that? And I'm just wondering, I'm just throwing this back at you, your question. I don't know if it's a rhetorical question, but I'm curious about what you think about that.
Yeah, sorry, that was for me, right? Yeah, okay. I think, yeah, like absolutely this question of like, what are we including people in? If the goal is inclusion, and the, you know, what exists in terms of what we're including people in this, you know, in this internet driven or like data driven economy, basically, you know, we're inviting people into a virtual world in which their you know, value is extracted from people, and there's predatory behaviors, there's behavioral nudging, there's predictive algorithms that kind of give people a nudge towards different kinds of behaviors. I mean, it's truly a question, and I think it's like absolutely critical, because there's so much energy towards like get people online, and that's so real, and it's a matter of life and death, as I think everybody said. I think Chris, you said this really well. People do need the internet for school, and you know, for many basics of life, it is life and death. But it's just also like, what is this world, you know? And as we turn, you know, as Mark Zuckerberg tells us to tear away from the fabric of our local communities and turn towards the metaverse, right? It just makes me think, to undesign this problem, we need to actually turn towards like the messy and the real, towards like where things are felt on the ground. So I have a lot of recommendations. Thank you, Sabrina. But I think like the basics are that, you know, we should not, as a community, which happens in the world of digital justice sometimes, where it's kind of like inclusion versus refusal. We need to actually build a different internet, and that's a really hard thing to do, but that's kind of like what we need to do. Big shouts out to the community tech community who are doing this, and Danny Peralta in the Bronx, who says, we don't want that old internet. We want the new internet that's not extractive and predatory.
Yeah, I think that gets at this question of design, which we'll get to in a moment. But just to take a question from the chat from our faculty director at the Vagelos Computational Science Center, Rebecca Wright, who asks, it seems that the current state of affairs is that there are opportunities for bias and racism, both in the algorithmic systems based on existing data and other methods, and in the way that they're part of a larger decision-making process by institutions and the people in them. And so she's asking, can these be fixed independently or must they be addressed together? And I'm gonna address this one to Chris, if you have a response to that.
Yeah, this is can they be can you repeat that last part? Can they be addressed independently, or
Can they be fixed independently, or must they be addressed together?
you know, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I'm very much I mean, unpopular opinion, like I actually don't think there's a fix for many of these things. You know, and what I mean by that is I think many of these systems should be abolished. Like I think about what Kathy O'Neill says, and yeah, I won't say it exactly right, but she says that algorithms are essentially opinion embedded in code. There's a sense that, you know, and we've had 20 years of being told this, that these systems, and again, people have alluded to this, but that there's a degree to which these systems, their existence, they exist to codify the things that society and tech companies want to do anyway, and to add a veneer of what's the word for it? Add the veneer of accuracy to them, right? That so that, and again, I point to an example from facial recognition, where someone in my city, Detroit, was falsely implicated by facial recognition, you know, put in handcuffs in front of his family and taken out of the police station. And he said, "That's not me," and it wasn't him. And the police officer said to him, "Oh, so I suppose the computer is wrong." And the computer was wrong, right? but like that veneer of accuracy that's laid on top of these systems, right? Because they're math, right? Because they're computational processes, because they're things that people, many of us, don't understand or aren't allowed to investigate. And so I think sometimes, you know, at the risk of reframing or not answering the question, I think one of the things I want to focus on, right, like I always like to say, is that some of these systems just shouldn't exist, right? So that hiring algorithms that you know, screen candidates, for instance, I don't think there's a way to make those non-biased. And I mean, we can go through a lot of different examples. So I think one of the things we want to move towards is we've had 20 years of people promoting the idea that innovation comes first. We see where the harms are, and hopefully, or perhaps we address them. And that's sort of the wrong way. I mean, it's not sort of the wrong way, it's absolutely the wrong way to go about things. If we think of other aspects of our lives, if I own a company that produces food or a drug, and there are some holes in these systems, right? But if I own a company that produces a food or a drug, I'm not allowed to just give food, you know, sell food to everyone, see who gets poisoned, and then later take the poison out of the food, right? I have to prove that it's not poison first before I can distribute it. We don't have a similar technological system or set up for technological systems, and I think we need to, because many of these systems shouldn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, anything built off the mantra "move fast and break things" will probably not be built with care. But Emmanuel, did you have something to add to that?
I don't know. The only thing that I can add to it is, I think, like to Chris's point, like, right, like algorithms and data add the veneer of objectivity of it. It's like, to his point, right? Like the computer is never wrong, but like no one ever questions how like the computer got its information or how the computer is processing that information. Like that's why the census question from last year was so important, like, because here's census, here's data, which is data is all basically a survey. And the census is then like deciding what resources go to which communities. But when you are adding a question that alienates a specific group of people, then you're never going to end up with complete data. And how to solve this, I don't know. I think like one of the I think low-hanging fruit in terms of the solution is the problem is the lack of diversity within the tech industry, right? Like there is a reason why Amazon has had all these problems with its hiring algorithms, hiring specifically like white men, or this facial recognition that confuses like Black faces, and then thinking about those problems and then seeing who has the ability to write these things and who has a seat at the table to either question these products or go along with them, right? And so I think that is a low-hanging fruit. Is it the real solution? I that's something I don't know. I don't have the answer to.
I just want to say one last thing, because these conversations, it's such a difficult problem, and I feel like it can often be like, especially on a day like today, it can just feel like the weight of this complexity. But just quickly, like there is a lot of money right now that is coming from the federal government. Yes, like it's an incredibly difficult environment to work in. There's also money coming from the state level, and there are going to be a lot of jobs for people who want to solve the problem of digital redlining. So let's be really, really smart and strategic. And, this is not a moment of like starvation for people who want to make a difference in this field. It is a moment of abundance. And so I think we need to be thinking again in the logics of like abundance and care and opportunity. And I know how hard that can be, but just putting that out there, because there are a lot of folks doing great work, and you can find them. So yeah, just would throw that in.
No, I think that gets at my final question. And again, we're coming up on the last 2 minutes. So if anyone has any questions they want to put into the chat, please do. Which gets at the design of the entire system, right? And so I'm wondering where the hope is for all of you. And I'm going to point to a quote by Vincent Lee, who's the Technology Equity Legal Counsel at the Greenlining Institute, who says, digital redlining is a system working as it was designed. And in relationship to the internet, how the internet should have been designed is as a utility. And at the end of the day, that's the only surefire way out of the inequities that we see of internet access. And at the same time, it's probably one of the least likely ways given the amount of money involved. So again, getting at the design of systems versus coming up against companies needing to meet their bottom line or the return on investment, as you say, Greta. And we do have a question in the chat that may be, related to your answers, which is, do you see participatory action research or other similar approaches as useful? So bringing in community design measures. So if any of you can take the final minute and say something each about where you see hope when it comes to digital redlining. And so I'll start with you, Greta, and then Emmanuel, and then Chris.
Yeah, the concrete example is, I know folks like, and I'll put some orgs in the chat who are working on the idea of like a rooftop network that's built from the ground up in Detroit, in the Bronx, that is solar powered with also rooftop panels, that's built by the community and people really claiming power and ownership over the infrastructure. So these things, it's a huge vision. Imagine an internet that is community driven and is not extractive of our personhood and environmental resources, but I truly believe in the people that are doing that work.
I think for me, I think the hope lies in like that the fact that these conversations are happening, and I think they're happening with a lot more frequency, that like data and algorithms aren't objective, that there is a lot of subjectivity put into them, that like algorithms sometimes like repeat the past discriminatory practices. And I think right once like the work that Greta and Chris have done, like the collection of this panel, like I think that is the hope, that like this information needs to get out there, that it is not a conversation that we were having like 10 years ago, right? That Google was in fact like an arbiter of truth, that it presented stuff like a library, but like with Sophia Noble's work, like we know that that's not true. And so I think like having that knowledge out there, I think that's where I think I find the hope, because sometimes I think it's easy to fall into a level of despair with all this stuff.
I would say, yeah, I definitely agree with what the previous two panelists said, and thank you for that. The addition I would make is that I think that we've seen and started to see quite a bit, the idea that an individual is going to solve this for him or herself or for themselves is kind of a trap, right? And so the ways that in which people are banding together, whether that's you know, people who live in an apartment building, whether that's you know, civil society groups, whether that's like collective bargaining and unions at tech companies, I think is really, really important. And so like the analogy I make with that is with the environment, right? Like individually, I mean, it's sure it's great if you recycle, but I mean, what we really need to do is force companies that are the big polluters to change what they do, and we need to do that same way. In the same way, we need to force these companies to change their practices and business models, and not get stuck in the notion that merely being included, right, or being able to change your settings is gonna change these things. Large scale action and like by a collective is really the thing that's gonna move the needle the most.
Thank you. I think that's a great way to conclude this discussion. And I just want to thank all of you, Greta, Emmanuel, Chris, for taking the time and joining us in this conversation. And we have a lot of thank yous in the chat. And so thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Saima, Chris, Emmanuel, Greta. We really appreciate your expertise. You've given us so much to think about this afternoon. So thank you again from the Undesign team. We really are very thrilled that you were able to share today with us. And we're going to take a short break, but I want to preview what's up next. At 3:45, we will have our next panel, which is Artists in Conversation. Three artists whose work has been added to the physical exhibition at Barnard share their interests in political education, care, abundance, and the healing properties of storytelling. The presentations will be followed by a panel conversation on the artist's work, connections to redlining, and their concepts of reclamation and resistance, and the broader role of artists in the justice movement. So we look forward to all of you joining us. That panel kicks off at 3:45. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you in a short while.